Dan Mack at the ACLU.
Hey, Daniel, how you doing?
All right, how are you?
Not bad. Do you know that your name comes through with the caller ID Kimberly Parker?
Yeah, I've heard. That's
Okay.
she set up our brand. I don't know why it is. I really need to look into that. Yeah.
She pays the phone bills.
Yeah, exactly. Basically.
Oh man. Well, thanks very much for taking time out of your day. And I'm guessing that you probably only have half an hour based on the reschedule.
Yes, unfortunately. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. No problem. No, I'm grateful that that Bianca hooked us up at all. I met with her and we had a great meeting. But it's hard to read how you are landing with people sometimes, and so I wasn't sure that anything would come of that meeting. So I'm really glad that it did, and that you're here now. So I don't know.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So um, I have like a spiel that I can give, or if you want to sort of do, I don't know what the best use of this time
Yeah,
is.
why? Yeah, well, feel free.
Uh, all right. So I know that you're sort of in charge of, I described my interests and some of the kind of solitary activism things that I've done to her, and she was like, "Well, that doesn't really fit under any exact category, but the closest thing that it does would be the religious liberty program and that's how you got in the picture." And so, and I
Got it.
so and let me start off with a little bit of an analogy here, because this is all rooted in my outreach is actually rooted in a criticism of the ACLU, even though I'm a big fan and a donor, and I volunteered with the Massachusetts branch. I live in Massachusetts, but I've spent a lot of time traveling over the last 5 years, and I have ties mainly through donation to the ACLU Tennessee and Oklahoma chapters, and I've had a phone call with the director of development of the Oklahoma chapter as well. So I've kind of I've I have a feeling sometimes that the ACLU views me as the smart but annoying guy that won't leave them alone at the party. Um, and so I don't I take no offense at that. There's a lot of truth in that. But I'm just going to sort of true to the stereotype, forge ahead and say my piece anyway.
Sure.
So the analogy I have of this criticism is like, I don't know if you're an Apple fanboy or an Android person.
Or Apple.
You're an Apple, okay, but I'm sure.
Actually, a little of both, but my phone's Apple. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm sure you've run into the type who is like an Android person, and they're like they hate Apple. And there's a whole big rant that they can deliver about how Steve Jobs was actually overrated and Apple is evil and so on. So what I feel like the ACLU kind of has turned into, especially since it seized upon the Project 2025 theme in its campaigning, is sort of like one of those anti-Apple, pro-Android people who doesn't quite have the courage to actually name Apple as their enemy. Like they're like, they clearly walk around hating Apple, but instead of saying that, they say, "Yeah, no, I don't hate Apple, but I hate the iPad and the iPhone, and I hate Apple TV." And they proceed to list every product that Apple puts out without actually saying Apple is the target of their antipathy. And so I feel like the ACLU is kind of in that position with respect to Christianity right now, where they're like, no, we're not going to say anything. We're not going to talk shit about Christianity or Christians at all, ever. But we're certainly against transphobia, and we're against, the LGBTQ curtailment of those rights. And we're definitely, against sort of any kind of over exuberant attempts to privatize school vouchers and weaken the boundary between education policy and religion. So they'll go through and they'll name all the products and services offered by American Christianity as the things that they're against or that they don't like, but they won't ever name Christianity as the company that's putting those products out. Does that how does that land with you?
I understand the points. I'm not sure I would entirely agree in the sense, well, let me say this. We have called out Christian nationalism. But Christians, I don't think we have, and I don't think we should. There's a great diversity of thought among Christians.
Yeah, no,
that represent Christians. There are Christians who are being prosecuted for, providing services to unhoused people, or who want a right to have a meal exchange at their church, or who want to provide sanctuary for immigrants or something like that. So I agree that there is a disturbing and dangerous, frankly, subset within Christianity that's essentially running our government at this point, or will be in a day or two. But and we have called them out, and we will call them out. But I don't think it's Christianity writ large.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that really I agree. Sort of hashtag not all Christians, right? I mean, I get that, and I think when I sort of studied this issue leading up to the activism campaign that lasted 4 years, that I'll describe in more detail in a bit. That I noticed that it's not. You're right. It's not all Christians, because you can sort of if you take Christians who are politically active, because there's a religious impulse that says withdraw from the world, don't engage in the world, don't try to advocate, don't try to change, because the world's inherently evil and sinful, and all you'll do is sully yourself. And so, but then if we take those people aside and zoom in on the Christians that actually think no, that we should engage with the world and try to advocate in its name, there's kind of like there are people who just want to do good, and then find that the most convenient pre-existing infrastructure for goodness doing that's already in place happens to be Christian churches, because those just have been around the longest, and that's been kind of the longest running banner of altruism that anybody can rally under in the country. And so they're using Christianity and the apparatus of American Christianity more as as a a means than as an end. And then there's the other side, and I think that's where Hegseth and that sentient cutout doll Mike Johnson, cardboard cutout Mike Johnson, those guys, their Christianity, their advocacy is explicitly rooted in what they, I believe, genuinely interpret the scriptures to say. This is the thing that a lot of liberals get wrong, I think, if they do bother to criticize Christianity, is they go, oh, these people, they've read the Bible and they haven't understood it. Their interpretation of it is what's wrong, not their enthusiasm for enacting the interpretation. And I think that kind of speaks to sort of a cognitive inability that a lot of secularists have, where they can't really imagine that people really believe this stuff. But I was raised Mormon in a very cult-like wing of Mormonism, and it took me a long time and I'm not an atheist now, but I spent a lot of time being an atheist before I fully managed to get away from that and see, my own journey clearly, and sort of the things that it left on me. That that I do understand that these people really do believe the things that they say they believe, and so that takes hypocrisy off the table as a thing that you can use to attack these people. You have to find, if you want to do battle with them, you have to do it within a headspace that they'll feel identified with, that they'll feel pertains to them, because they're very inoculated against ideas that don't originate from within that worldview. And that's why a lot of the liberty-based appeals that the ACLU and other leftist organizations make about in transphobia and LGBTQ rights and so on, about when you try to couch those things in the language, the sort of more neutral and less valuative language of civil liberties and civil rights and mere freedoms, then that either doesn't show up on the moralistic radar at all of the Christian, or it does, but it immediately gets dismissed to a lesser status because there's so much bigger fish to fry in the Christian mind. So with that, I was trying to figure out, like, I'm interested, I'm not an institution, unlike the ACLU. So I can sort of play a little faster and looser with my own reputation than an institution can. And I can take risks and do things that are questionable more than an institution can, especially one like the ACLU that really does, and truthfully, by the way, I'm not criticizing this part, that does put itself out there as an organization trying to do good and trying to be on the right side of history. Um, and so what I basically did was, because I'm also a software engineer and I tend to think about things, programmatically, algorithmically. And I noticed that the Bible, the Christian Bible, the King James Bible, has kind of, if you think of it as a piece of cognitive software that Christians are kind of downloading and installing into their minds and running in their minds as they go about and practice their faith in their lives, um, that there's a bug in that. There's a bug, an inconsistency that's visible from within inside that worldview that if somebody wanted to try to exploit it, they could try to exploit it. And so that's essentially that the, when I mentioned that inoculation against the ideas that come from moral ideas that come from outside of Christianity, and moral ideas that aren't expressed using that Baroque, archaic King James English, the thous and these and thys and stuff. They really love that stuff. And if you, even if you're from a moral reasoning standpoint, even if your points are sound and good, if you can't express them in that King Jamesy fashion to them, they just kind of, it's just a more coarse grained filter that will discard what you're trying to get into them. And
yeah, I think that's right.
so what I noticed is that within the end times lore, the eschatology of Christianity, there is this figure that's the Antichrist, or the beast of the sea is the official title. And there's a short but powerful kind of set of prophetic claims that are made about that. There's sort of a transcendental job description laid out for that personage, and it sort of requires that Christians both revile and despise a figure, but also pay attention to what that figure says. They can't use their reviling and despising of the figure as an excuse to ignore what that figure says, the way they use that as an excuse to ignore any other secular bit of opinion about the world or about morality or whatever. So they can't, this is the one alarm that they can't snooze according to their own rules. They have to pay attention to the edicts of this figure, assuming, they have to recognize the figure as having that position. But if they do, then the power that figure wields is they now have command over the attention of the Christian mind, by Christianity's own rules. And so I decided to take a run at doing that. I spent 4 years. I basically wrote from scratch a scriptural forgery in which and I'd say about a third of the text of the scriptural forgery is actually copy and paste from the original King James version of the Bible. But the story that's told in the scriptural forgery reuses many of the same names and places and even events in some cases, and nations and peoples and so on. A lot of the identifiers that appear in the canonical text of the Bible also appear in my forgery. But the story told by my forgery is a drastic realignment of those elements in such a way that to the extent that it has messages about morality that are encoded in it, those messages are completely opposite from those encoded in the canonical text of the Bible. And so it was an attempt to sort of Trojan horse these modern moral ideas that have their roots in secularism, but sneak them in. The coating on this bitter pill would be something that is the King James English and the veneer of authenticity of this scriptural forgery that doesn't bear my name. It's attributed to it's attributed to the Antichrist. So it's the Book of Aaron was the name of this thing, and I wrote it, and I because I was a software engineer and because a lot of this was taking place during the pandemic, remote work was very easy to come by. And so I was working remotely for doing IT work full time for a company in the Boston area, but doing it, I had an Airstream travel trailer, 30-foot Airstream Classic travel trailer, and I basically hit pretty much every state in the lower 48 at least once, and several of them many times, and printed and distributed about 2,000 copies of this scriptural forgery by hand. And it did it just, printed them out and put them in various waterproof containers and distributed them across Christian churches all across the country. And with this title page that sort of deliberately throws down a gauntlet. So if you are one of those Christians that really is running this cognitive software in your mind and really does is sincere about trying to enact all of these things in your own life, then I was trying to sort of induce a false spiritual experience in them by, they're walking out of church one Sunday and they look down and what's this? And they pick it up and it's this whole thing that claims to have been stolen from the Vatican archive and, translated from the original Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew, by the Antichrist. And then there's this 3-page sort of afterword, the translator's afterword that directly marks this challenge or presents this challenge and says, you, dear Christian reader, are basically a coward if you refuse to acknowledge what I am. And so it was, when I told this story to Bianca, I was much more, I went to much greater pains to kind of couch it all in the language of, I'm aware of the psychology and the questions that this could raise about my psychology, that I did this or that I thought about this. And I'm kind of, because we don't have much time, I'm skipping over all that. And so I'm just stating sort of the facts of the case.
Sure.
But, we could, if you were interested, we could certainly have another discussion where I kind of reassure you of my bona fides as a non-insane person. There was a time, my own faith in this gambit was kind of fluctuating during this period too. So there was a window of time in the middle of that where I actually thought this might work, in the sense that it might garner Christians making public displays or public statements, like on social media or something like that they had found this and that they believed that this was an authentic document, and then therefore believed that, the person who translated it really did hold this title and really should be, given credence as a valid claimant to that title. And if that had worked, when I did think that was a possibility, the goal was going to be basically to see if I could split the GOP by stealing all of the Christian fundamentalists away from the GOP. Because right now, if you steal the Christian fundamentalists away from the GOP, the electorate that's left is basically what, like hedge fund executives, and that's all? Like, there's not a whole lot going on electorally for the GOP that isn't rooted in either obscene wealth or Christianity. And so I was trying to sort of fight fire with fire, use that moral division within them, within their own ranks, against them, and then eventually stopped and gave up on that. But part of the reason that I gave up on it was essentially I learned that what I was doing was being mistaken for anti-Semitism by some, because one of the critical bullet points that's laid out in the book of Revelation that this figure is supposed to have, or by which we are to recognize this figure, Christians are to recognize this figure, is that they, it's funny because the title is the Antichrist, but the things that person does don't refer to Christ at all. They all refer to Yahweh, the OG deity that, Judaism originally instantiated. And so my scriptural forgery takes aim directly at Yahweh and is a work of consummate blasphemy targeted at that God. And so if you're a Jew and you read the book, then you come away going, "Oh my God, this is a horrifying work of anti-Semitism," and I sort of vaguely was aware of that possible misinterpretation in the back of my mind when I was writing it, but I was I perceived myself to be under time pressure, first of all, when I was writing it, and so that's why there's a lot of bugs, as a programmer would say, in it. But that's the biggest one, is that, if you didn't see the title page, where and the sort of the document is bookended by this material that sort of reassures the reader, no, this is a Christian thing, it's an anti-Christian thing, whatever its polarity is, it's organized around Christianity and not Judaism. But if you didn't know that and you just read the story of it, it's it would very, very obviously come through, or register as a work of anti-Semitism. And so that has unfortunately drawn law enforcement attention on me, and I've paid a certain amount of social cost because of it. And those factors are part of why I've kind of given up on fully trying to pursue it. But what it does is, I think, signal to the ACLU that, if the ACLU leadership, national leadership, were ever to decide that shit's getting real and things are more dire than the traditional staid institutional, let's just, go out on the field of the Supreme Court and put all our energy out there and do the best we can case by case. If there's another kind of approach or another kind of activism that ever becomes appealing, or non-repugnant to the ACLU leadership, then I might be a good person for them to talk to, and I would be willing to sort of pursue that, because I think I've thought more about this angle, this religious angle on these political problems, than most people. And so I'm kind of, my goal here is to sort of, I'm in this delicate position where I know I've done kind of a certainly bizarre and possibly horrifying thing. But in the process of doing it, I've learned a lot of stuff that could be useful if this knife fight kind of turns into a gunfight, so to speak. And so I just, that was um, that was an Untouchables reference, by the way. That wasn't an incitement to violence, but so no,
I'm a big fan.
okay, all right, so good. So yeah, so I'll stop there, but that's basically what I did and what I discussed with Bianca, and what led to her referring me to you.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. Interesting idea. Obviously, I haven't thought any more about it than what just sitting on this call. I'm skeptical that there's anything that we would do with it, frankly, for the reasons you pointed out. I know you may take issue with our approach. I mean, I would just say, it's unlikely, but who knows? My one question about this, though, I think it's a creative idea. That it rests on, for it to work, it rests on a number of assumptions, right? But one of which, though, is that Christians, and in particular, I'm thinking Protestants, I'm more on the Protestant side than Catholic side, right? One of the main reasons for the original schism in the first place or among them, right, was this notion that we as Christians, this is them talking, not me, right? And this is your point, right? We should engage with the Bible and have a personal relationship with the Bible and with God, and not have our clergy be the intermediaries between us and God, right? Some version of that. And we should be reading Scripture, and we should be going directly to the text, right? That's the idea. But is that actually how it works in practice? In other words, is a Christian going to be persuaded by text if their pastor tells them otherwise? Like, how many Christians out there are actually engaging one-on-one with the text without their congregation, without their clergy? So, so for it to work, that would have to happen, right?
Yes. Yep.
And maybe it will, and maybe it is happening, but I'm skeptical that that's actually happening in these Christian congregations, in these sort of right-leaning Christian communities. I mean, are they really going to say, "Oh, here's a new thing I've discovered, I'm going to engage with myself," or are they going to listen to, because there's, as you alluded to early in this call, right, that there's you can take Scripture and go in any direction you want with it. right? So there are so many passages which would seem to be in the Bible, which would seem to completely contradict the Christian nationalist agenda entirely, but they don't seem bothered by that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the fact that you're right is part of why I gave up. I think that that there isn't a lot, even though Protestantism talks a good game about the sort of a direct individual to the text kind of relationship. In practice, you don't see a lot of that. You do see some of it, and I think I may have been primed to see more of it than is actually there because of the Mormon heritage. I think Mormonism as a subspecies of Protestantism is a little more interested in doing its homework than some other ones. And so, but you know, that when I sort of imagined like what would the uptake in the ideal scenario where like things actually work, sort of what would the stages of that rocket launch look like? And I think, you know, you're right that it wouldn't be the case that the chances of somebody picking it up and seeing it and being biblically literate enough and being interested enough in reading it and then being biblically literate enough to like go, wow, this is really horrifying, because it is one of those things that the more you are familiar with the original Old Testament, the more your mind is blown by what's being said in this alternate version. And so, like, whereas if you don't know anything about the Bible as it is, then you read it and just go, wow, that was just as boring as the actual Bible. Okay. So you kind of have to already kind of have a value schema in your mind laid over the original text to appreciate the rework. But the thing, so yeah, so it's vanishingly small chance that the person that actually happens upon the physical document then is in a position to read it and have that experience. But all it takes is and I figured if somebody did pick it up and do that, then the first thing they would do is go up their own sort of ecclesiastical chain of command. You know, they would go to their pastor or they would go to their priest or archbishop or whatever, and be get it sort of like, I think the tipping point in this imagined success path would have to be that some kind of critical mass of rank and file people that find it and report it, and they don't want to believe it, but they also don't feel comfortable dismissing it out of hand. They report it to actual authorities, and the actual authorities are like, well, we can't really we can't really dismiss it either. Like, it's certainly heretical, but it's not any, to the extent that we claim that the Bible has historicity to it. This document has just as much historicity to it as the original Bible does. And again, there's a little bit of shock value here in the nomenclature of it being attributed to the Antichrist and using that language. I mean, in the post-pandemic world, the pandemic kind of carried a sort of shit's getting real vibe to it that even secularists kind of were like wondering, the phrase "the end times," would never normally pop into Richard Dawkins's mind, but he used the term early in the pandemic. So there was kind of, people were sort of, I think your take on the statistics here are exactly right, but there were two mitigating factors that I kind of seized on to give myself a little more hope when I was still actively working on it.
Sure, understood. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a creative idea, and believe me, one thing that I would not close my mind to at this point, given the way things are headed, is creative ideas that we haven't thought of yet, because we need some. So, yeah, I actually have to hop on this other call.
No problem.
I love that you're sort of thinking outside the box, and I hate that phrase. So I apologize, but I love it. Yeah, and obviously you've thought a lot about this, including some of the hurdles. But yeah, I keep thinking creatively is what I would urge anyone who's troubled by the situation. We need that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'll let you go. And if you run across anybody else in the ACLU ranks that you think might be interested in this, whole thing, then feel free to give them my info. I'm happy to talk about it.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Jan. Bye.
All right. Take care.